You're listening to a social justice podcast hosted by NICOLA SPURLING, brought to you by The Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book.
Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING, and today I'm joined by Will Woods for a conversation about Forbidden Vancouver Walking Tours. Can you introduce yourself, please, Will?
Sure, Nicola. Yeah, so my name is Will, and I am the founder and general manager of Forbidden Vancouver Walking Tours. I founded the company back in 2012. Our goal is to share Vancouver history, the good and the bad, with locals and with tourists to explore the most interesting spaces and share the most interesting stories about our city.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining today. I was on one of your tours just a couple weeks ago and had an amazing time. We were just talking about it before the podcast started, and I can't wait to explore how this came to be and what you're trying to accomplish. And my first question for you is just what is Forbidden Vancouver Walking Tours and how did it come to exist?
I kind of trace it back to a couple of experiences I had when I was younger that I think really planted a seed in me and inspired me to start the company kind of years later. And one of those was the Edinburgh Ghost Tours in Edinburgh, Scotland.
Oh.
Where I went with my girlfriend of the time, now wife, Alicia, back in, I think like 2004, maybe, around there. I was just really impressed with the quality of delivery, the quality of the guides, how they wove theatre into their performances. I mean, Edinburgh's got so much history. It goes back like hundreds of years, and it's got these old crypts and underground spaces and stuff. And I remember being in this sort of underground cavern that was like hundreds of years old, and there were all these candles in there, and they're telling a ghost story. And you could really feel a chill go down your spine in that kind of space and ambience that they'd created. And I was really impressed. I remember being they took us to this one place that was like this big steel-looking gate that was, I don't know, 20 feet high between these. In my memory, it was like 20 years ago, but it was this huge gate by these two old buildings. And they said, "Oh, this gate's here because when the plague came to Edinburgh, they locked all the plague victims behind this gate, and they'd throw like bits of meat over the gates to feed them." But they basically all just, died in there, and you could hear their screams throughout the city. Thinking, wow, like you're standing right next to this gate that's still here, but hundreds of years later, it has this sort of macabre history. And so I think that really struck me at the time. I thought, wow, you can really create something just with guides or actors, storytelling on the street. You can really create something doing that. Mm. And then, a few years later, we moved here. We moved here in 2006, and we went on a trip down to Seattle, took the underground Seattle tour that I'm sure many listeners have experienced as well. And again, I was impressed, I think, both with, we had a great guide that day. It's a fascinating history they tell you about this underground world that exists in Seattle. He was a very, charismatic, funny man that led us on this tour. And I was also impressed by just the scale of business that they'd built and the number of people they have going through that experience. Now it's become like a kind of must-do experience for people visiting Seattle. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking, well, Vancouver really needs something like that as well. We're a very similar Pacific Northwest city, a similar size, similar history. And there wasn't anything like that in the city at the time. So I thought, well, there's an opportunity there. I was working in a sort of corporate job for a company called Deloitte, who I joined in 2002 in London and worked there for 4 years, then transferred to the Vancouver office in 2006 and worked here for a few years. But I'd always thought to myself, I don't really want to pursue a career here long term. It was nice to move here with the company, and they were great, and I have a lot of friends who still work there, but it wasn't really my thing. Mm-hmm. And I'd always had this desire to start my own business. I was really drawn to, because of these sort of formative experiences I had, I was drawn immediately to starting something in storytelling, street performance, sharing history, exploring urban spaces. So it all kind of wove together into this idea of Forbidden Vancouver that I started in 2012. And it was just me on my own in a funny hat. I'm still wearing a funny hat today, in a funny hat, on the streets of Gastown talking about Vancouver history. And the first tour that I built was around Prohibition history. We still run a walking tour on Prohibition history today. I think it's a really little known and interesting chapter in Canadian history, is the history of Prohibition that became part of US kind of folklore, national mythology around the Prohibition era and Al Capone and speakeasies in Chicago and New York City and, all those, all that sort of almost iconography of that era of the Tommy guns and all the sharp suits that the gangsters wore. And it just has not been part of Canadian, national identity in the same way. But we had Prohibition here in exactly the same way. And we had massive corruption in government. We had bootlegging and, huge sort of underground crime figures making fortunes from selling illegal booze. There was a lot of smuggling of liquor down to the States once Prohibition ended here, and it carried on down there. This huge enterprise of rum running, which made some people a huge fortune. And I thought that's a really interesting history that I was interested to learn about. And I thought, well, I'd like to share that. And so that was the first tour. And since then, we've done many, many different tours and experiences over the 11 or 12 years or so since then.
Right. And you have quite a large team, it seems now. So how difficult is it to find people who can bring that combination of understanding history and also being able to present it in a way that's really interesting?
Yeah, I think it is. In some ways it's hard. In some ways I think we're really fortunate in that we get a ton of interest. And when we put a job posting up, we have, sometimes we'll have over 100 people apply for, one or two positions as guides that we might recruit in a year. I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think there's people in the city who love Vancouver and its history and love the idea of sharing that with audiences. And there's not many avenues for that. There's a lot of people who are really into Vancouver and its history. And you can see that on Facebook and Instagram, on various Facebook groups that are out there, of the huge number of likes and comments that posts get about, archive photographs of the city, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. There's definitely a really big community in the city of people who really care about Vancouver and its history. I think there's people in that community who love the idea of storytelling and sharing that history out on the streets. And there's also a massive acting community in the city. There's, as you know, a huge film business here. A lot of the time it's feast or famine for actors. Mm-hmm. And I think especially for theatre actors, it can be really hard trying to make that into a full-time career. And we provide, steady, stable, predictable paid work for people who want to perform and love an audience. So I see our guides coming from those two different camps, and depending on their experience, we might direct them to one or, a different tour. If you're more of an acting background, then you'll be steered towards the Lost Souls of Gastown, which is fully delivered in character. We only use professional actors for that experience. Some of our other tours, well, they're more like conventional walking tours. You don't need to be an actor. So, and I like having that kind of breadth of experience and kind of aptitude in the team, where people have bring different skills and different personal knowledge bases and different experiences they've had to the work. And we try and recruit people of all genders and all ages. A diversity of ethnic backgrounds as well that reflects how diverse our city is. I think it's important as a company we represent that in our guide team.
And why is it so important that we understand our history? Or what are you hoping to accomplish with your organization and teaching people about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess you could, there's plenty of historians out there who I'm sure get asked that question, why is history important? And there's kind of these cliches like, oh, if you don't understand your history, you're doomed to repeat it, and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I don't think I have that as a kind of mantra that I keep in mind around why, the purpose of showing Vancouver history. I just find it really interesting. I'm like, well, I live here and I'm so interested to know what's happened in this place. I think if I lived anywhere, I'd have similar. I was interested living in London in my younger years, about London history. The lens I always have on building experiences is, well, do I find this interesting? If I find this story interesting, chances are, I think if we build a tour and include it, the audience will find it interesting too. So for me, I think it's more just about trying to understand the place we are, the stories that have sort of come before us as the current residents of the city, why it is the way it is. I think you can look at any neighborhood in the city, any community in the city, and they've got a story that's probably interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to get a sense of what this shift was like for you when you went from the corporate world to doing this type of work. What is it that you were doing previously?
Yeah, it was difficult for me actually to begin with, really, really hard. I was working for Deloitte in their risk advisory practice. I was a senior manager by the time I left. So I kind of worked my way up from like consultant to senior manager, sort of like non-financial audit work, assessing how companies are using technology to meet their various requirements on them from their own clients or from regulators. It wasn't really my thing. I kind of started, I was like left university at 2021 and I was like, oh, I need to get a job. Well, this seems to be a good job. It's in, it's in London. It's a place with a company where you can, progress and have a career there. And I was kind of set on that sort of corporate career for myself, but it wasn't the right fit for me. And it was quite evident to me early on that wasn't the right fit. I actually almost started a tour company in the UK back in like 2004 with a guy I was working with at Deloitte. A bus tour company around the UK, but we didn't, for various reasons, it never got started. But I knew right away it wasn't the right fit. I felt like it was like a placeholder for me. It was when actually my eldest child was born that's when I thought, well, I was about 31 then, and I thought, if I don't try this, to try and start my own business and start this project that I think is going to be really, really fun and interesting, I'm never going to do it. Because I could see it. I could see the car payments and the mortgage, and that, and then having those financial commitments of, as a parent in a very expensive city with children, I was like, the window's going to close, and I'm not going to ever do it. So I thought, now's the time. I have to try. And my wife was extremely supportive of this. I can't give her enough thanks for everything that she did to me to help me, pursue this dream. And she was a real rock through the whole process and an incredible advisor to me in soundboard for all these, ideas and questions and problems that come up when you start your own company. But going back to your question, I think the thing that I found hardest was, I'd been in this corporate world and I was very preoccupied with I don't know if assumptions is the right word, or fears of judgment from my former colleagues, and what they would think of me starting this company. And I remember when I resigned, I was like the head of the department. He was a really nice guy. And I said to him, I'm leaving. And he was used to people saying that and saying they're joining a competitor or they're going to a client or, some other corporate similar thing in a different place. And I said, I'm going to start a walking tour company. And I could see like his jaw almost hit the floor. And I think he said something like, oh, that sounds like really small fry. Or that sounds like something really like a not worth doing kind of sentiment. Mm-hmm. That was kind of his instinct, I think, when he heard about it. And maybe I didn't do a good enough job of articulating my sort of vision for it. It wasn't just like, he was a really nice guy, but all the people I worked with, I felt like almost like embarrassment that like I'm leaving this good job in sort of quotation marks to start this sort of frivolous, silly thing that isn't going to go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And I carried that with me for a long time. For a couple of years in starting the company, I felt like insecurity around it. And then now I look back, I think, why do I care what a bunch of people who work at this company think about what I do? I'm proud of what we've accomplished, and we've come a long way. And I speak to people from time to time who have ideas for starting their own business, and I always try and be encouraging and share that my own story of going through what it's like to start something very different. I didn't have really any background in particular, apart from just my own study around Vancouver history. I had enrolled in acting school for a year in the evenings in Gastown to try and improve as a public speaker and as an actor, which was extremely helpful for me. But yeah, it took a long time to deal with that insecurity, and I sense that's probably true for most people starting their own company. It's not so much the fear of failure; it's the fear of other people's judgment about the potential for one to fail doing it.
Interesting. Yeah, I sort of have a different experience myself, because I started a company when I was 21, and that was sort of viewed as an incredible feat, right? A little bit of a different...
What was the company?
A construction company.
Oh, right.
So I still run it. It's NES Design and Construction. I do residential renovation work. Oh. And that's something that I've been doing on and off over the last more than a decade, I guess, at this point. But it was more when I started this role at the Flag Shop as a social justice ambassador that I got the judgment, right? Because I was leaving construction. I was leaving this industry where you can make a lot of money if you're committed to it. And I just went, it's too hard on my body. And I also was doing so much advocacy work that when someone said, I'll pay you to do advocacy work, I went, oh, well, okay, now I can really ramp things up and do even more. So no regrets, but it's sort of, I'm seeing parallels and differences in terms of, I understand what it's like to be judged for moving into a different role, but it wasn't for starting a company. It was actually the opposite. It was going into employment for someone else.
But maybe the common thread there, just reflecting on what you're saying, it's not so much about the changing of the role. It's about giving up income.
Yeah, I think that is,
because we live in a very expensive city. We live in a capitalist system, right, where one's income is seen as this sort of like status symbol. And I worked away at Deloitte for years and went up, moved up the ranks to senior manager, and the next step was to try and make it to partner, which I knew I didn't want to do. But I think the idea that somebody would reject the opportunity to make partner, which is a very well-paid position, to go and like walk around outside telling stories about Vancouver history. Maybe it was the income sacrifice that prompted those insecurities in me. Maybe, and then maybe it's similar for you. I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think I make a little bit less, not too much, but definitely when you look at that position of a social justice ambassador as opposed to someone who runs a construction company, there's a much higher potential to earn money in the construction industry than there is doing something like this. But this is just something that I'm much more passionate about. And it sounds like you feel the same way about these walking tours. It's not always about money. Sometimes it's just about being able to enjoy life and what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think, being able to sort of express your identity through your work's really important. And work's a big part of your life. It's like hours a day, most days of the week. Mm-hmm. And I think I've found part of my identity through my work with Forbidden Vancouver that I never really felt I fitted in before,
Mm-hmm. And I imagine there must have been a huge learning curve when you switched industries and started doing this. And obviously you had an interest in history, so you probably knew a lot already. But what was that learning curve like?
I think it's probably a cliche that anyone who starts a business makes tons of mistakes and wastes loads of time on things that they shouldn't have done. Which I definitely did. I think it was actually less around the fundamental work of the company of building and leading walking tours. I worked pretty hard at an acting school, in learning about public speaking. I was doing tons of tours myself personally, so I was getting a good feel for what worked, what didn't work. I was doing a ton of reading on Vancouver history, so I quickly ramped up really fast on my learning about the history of the city. So that I felt fairly quickly, I felt pretty comfortable with. But the running of a company, I definitely made some big mistakes in how to run a company that I'm sure I continue to do, because you want a tour company, you 50% run a tour company and you 50% run an online marketing business, trying to get people to buy tickets to the tour. And I never went, studied marketing. I don't have any certifications or qualifications in digital marketing. I have an agency now that we work with, which is invaluable. I also have a marketing manager, Sasha, who's been incredible for us as well. But it took a long time to grow the company to be big enough to bring in resources to help. And for a long time, it was just me doing everything and making ridiculous decisions. A lot of the time that meant I burnt through tons of time trying to fix things that I'd got wrong, bookkeeping. Why didn't I hire a bookkeeper right away? What was I thinking trying to do it myself, without any training in bookkeeping? But I feel I learned a lot of really important lessons. I feel now we're in a really good place as a company. We've got a really good team. Certainly the last couple of years coming out of the pandemic have been I feel like it's really getting into a place where I'm not so hands-on myself. I can be more involved in planning and decision-making and supporting the guides, rather than being knee-deep in every single detail all the time,
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of teams, I took the Really Gay History Tour a couple of years ago, and I highly recommend that to our audience. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this, but we host this podcast on a site called fabulouslyqueer.ca. So a bit of a tie in there, right? And I know that was created by Glenn, is it Tsłuch?
Tsłuch, yeah.
So it's not necessarily your tour, but since we host the podcast on this website and we have a fairly large queer audience, and I'm queer myself, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to explain how that tour came to be and sort of what it's all about.
Sure, yeah. So Glenn joined Forbidden Vancouver about 6 years ago, maybe going on 7 years now. It's a fantastic guide and was leading, I think, a couple of our walking tours for maybe a year or two, and then approached me and said, well, we need to do a walking tour on gay history. And I'd I'd had this thought for a while about doing a walking tour on gay history, and I'd actually talked to a previous guide who identified as gay who'd had a similar suggestion, but wasn't really in the right place in their life to be able to actually go out and build a tour. Maybe didn't even really want to do that. It's a big undertaking, right? So, but the idea of it, we were both really keen on. So from quite early on in the company's history, that this idea had been percolating about a walking tour on gay history. And so Glenn approached me and said, well, maybe we should do this walking tour. And I was into it right away. And it was evident to me that I'm a straight cis man. For me to build a walking tour on gay history, I'm not the right person to do that. I'm into supporting the process. I'm into our company having that experience in its like portfolio of tours and experiences. But I can't be out there leading the tour myself. You know, it needs to be someone who's from that community. And Glenn identifies as gay and had a ton of enthusiasm to get stuck into doing the research. Glenn loves writing. He's a very skilled writer. So we thought, yeah, let's do it. Let's get into it. So I was kind of a coaching role for him. He'd never built a walking tour before. Obviously, he'd led walking tours. So I was kind of a coaching role. We had this kind of brainstorming session at my house on a whiteboard with the two of us. I had a couple of beers and spent a few hours kind of brainstorming what we could include in the tour. Yeah, our initial thought was, well, is there enough history in the city to actually fill a whole walking tour around gay history? And it quickly became evident, not only is there enough history, the hardest thing about building that tour, and Glenn will testify to this as well, is what to leave out, because there's so much history, and not just, the history of gay men, but the whole rainbow and all the different groups that fit into that LGBTQ2+ community or communities all have stories to share.
And such a long history too. I mean,
Sure.
Part of it was two-spirit identities, which goes back thousands of years.
Definitely, yeah. So Glenn did a very impressive body of research and continues to do so. He's become a real expert on queer history in the city. He's struggled with what to leave out of that tour for sure. But what he's put in is absolutely fantastic. And I think one of the great things, or maybe one of the great things about that tour is that, most of our tours, the era they're talking about, late Victorian era, maybe into the 20th century, up to, say, the Second World War, is usually as late as we go in terms of the content and the stories we tell. So there's no one around, right, you can really talk to about this. If you're talking about, like pre-World War I, like everyone's passed away. So There's no one you can talk to. But queer history is still being made. Mm-hmm. There's people alive today with amazing stories to tell. And so, Glenn was able to go out and meet people and interview people himself and capture quotes and comments and perspectives that he's able to share on the tour. Like, Jamie Lee Hamilton, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, he interviewed Jamie and was able to use that content to bring so much personality and first-hand first-person perspective to her story, which wouldn't be the same just from reading newspaper articles or that kind of thing. So that's that kind of personal, the personal connection he's been able to have with people of great importance in the queer community has been really special. Maybe the greatest thing about the tour is how personally connected Glenn is himself personally to that subject matter, and how so many of the audience members who come are personally connected as well, and who are able to share their own stories on the tour about a myriad of different topics, from what the West End used to be like, to the AIDS crisis, to being a member of the United Church on Burrard Street when the first ordained outwardly gay minister in the whole country was the minister there. These are personal stories that are really meaningful for people, and when they're able to hear those stories or share those stories themselves, sometimes it's a really emotional time on that tour. Sometimes people are in tears on that tour. You might have a whole group who are really experiencing sort of a profound moment together. And I think that's really special. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I have some personal experience with that, because when I was on the tour, a friend of mine brought up the fact that I'd run in politics.
Oh, okay.
So I ended up getting into a conversation with Will around that, and we had an email exchange afterwards. Exactly. Yeah, with Glenn. And it was really interesting because I didn't really think at the time about it being sort of history, right? But my friend goes, well, you were one of 4 people who ran in the 2017 election who was trans, and it's the first time any trans person had run for election at a provincial level.
Wow,
so
fabulous.
The 4 of us did, in a way, make history.
Yeah,
but it was so recent at the time that we took that tour. It was within the last couple of years that I'm going, well, that's not history. That's present tense. That's just life, right?
But a great example.
Yeah, it's incredible. And for those of our audience who are interested in taking the tour, like I said, I highly recommend it. One of the most interesting aspects of it for me was the kiss-in.
Yeah, great story, yeah.
Great story. And I mean, I'm not going to spoil the tour for everyone.
Glenn hates me sharing bits of the tour out in the world because he wants people to experience it and not to have, spoilers out there. So I won't share too much about that, but it was at the Castle Beer Parlour on Granville Street, and it's no longer there. I think it's where Best Buy is today. But people are going to have to come on the tour and find out what happened. That's where it was, but it was...
Yeah, we'll give you a little teaser there.
You go.
Go check out the tour. When it comes to crafting all of this information for the tours, how do you make sure that the information you're presenting is accurate and unbiased?
Oh, I think unbiased, that's a really loaded
because everything's going to be biased.
I mean, it's not unbiased. It's got a lot of my personal bias in it, It would be naive of me to think that I'm just telling completely objective, factually accurate, tours without any personal bias whatsoever. Obviously, if I'm doing the research and I'm writing it, then my own personal bias creeps into those tours, and the same with Glenn for the Really Gay History Tour. And we are a progressive leading organisation. I don't apologise for that or try and hide that. That's the nature of the company that we have and the line that we take in our work. But we are thoroughly researched. I try to avoid. I like to subscribe to the idea of show not tell. And if I'm an audience member, I don't want to go on a tour and be told how to think. Be told, have someone else's political points of view kind of thrust down my throat. I've not come to like a political meeting, where I'm going to hear from like some candidate about like how the world should be. So I make a deliberate effort not to do that, and I welcome people of all political persuasions and backgrounds to come on the tour and hear the stories of the stories of Vancouver's past. So, but I do think I like us as storytellers in the company to share the stories of Vancouver's past and to show people what it was like, and then people can make their own conclusions and draw their own conclusions about the rights and the wrongs of decisions that were made in the past, compared to today, for example. But I suppose it's in the selection of the stories and parts of each story that are included versus left out, and the perspectives that are included and left out where my own personal bias likely creeps in.
Right. You're going to tell the stories that you're the most interested in.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And can you explain what Project Sunrise is?
Yeah, Project Sunrise came about a couple of years ago, where it was kind of drew together a number of different threads in our company that I felt I'm kind of mangle this metaphor, but they were kind of blowing in the wind, and I wanted them to do a better job around reconciliation, to put it succinctly. And I felt like our hearts and our intentions are in the right place from day one around this, but I think we suffered from a lack of knowledge and a lack of consultation. It was a path where we were doing land acknowledgements on tours, but I wasn't convinced that we were doing as good a job as we could have done. I felt like I was very uncertain as the company owner about sharing history related to our Indigenous communities, and I'm conscious that we're a private company. My wife and I own the company. I didn't want to be accused of, walking around telling stories about, the Indigenous communities of our city and be seen as trying to make money off what is often a very traumatic past, at the hands of colonialism. And like, I'm a white guy from England. I'm like the worst person to be walking around talking about, Indigenous history, given that many of the people inflicting the most harm on local Indigenous communities were from England.
Right. Speaking of bias, I guess.
Right. So but I felt, at the same time, I felt a responsibility to share those stories. And if not me, then who? like who else is going to, I own a walking tour company. Like we should be out there talking about these things. And that was one of the reasons that our Stanley Park tour came about, the Dark Secrets of Stanley Park, because I felt like a lot of our tours were focused on really settler history in and around Gastown. And I felt like I spent a lot of time in Stanley Park. I think, I'm not the only one out there who thinks it's an incredible asset for our city. What a spectacular place it is to go for a walk or a run or, a picnic. I'm a keen runner, and I've run a lot in the park, and I have done for many years. And it was, as I started the company, it was increasingly apparent to me how little acknowledgement there is in the park of the indigenous people that lived on that land for so long, for like millennia. And it feels like a deliberate effort by the city to hide that history.
Right.
So, or at least there's a sort of obliviousness to the responsibility to share it. And I think things have improved a little bit in that regard in recent years. I can talk about that in a moment. Running through the park early in the morning thinking, this is a really nice park. I'd be interested to know what the history of this land and the people who've lived here. So that got me thinking of the idea of doing a Stanley Park walking tour. And I was helped by the work of a really, really incredible historian called Jean Barman, who wrote a book called Stanley Park Secret, probably about 10 years ago. She did fantastic research on the stories of people who lived in the park before it became a park, their expulsion by the city, and the brave, courageous individuals who managed to stick it out and continue to live in the park despite the full onslaught of the city of Vancouver trying to evict them. I almost feel like it's sort of a must read for any Vancouverite, that book. It really blows wide open a lot of misconceptions, I think, that are out there about the park being this untouched rainforest that suddenly was made a park for the benefit of all Vancouverites. That's a story that people like to tell, but the reality is a lot darker than that. There's also a book called Inventing Stanley Park by a writer called Sean Courage, which talks about that exact myth about how it wasn't ever really an untouched rainforest. It was home to humans for so long. The huge changes that have been wrought to the flora and fauna of the park at the hands particularly of settlers since it became a park. So I thought, this is interesting history that needs to be shared. And so we launched that tour about 7 years ago. And I struggled with the tour because I felt stuck between wanting to share these stories but feeling like I didn't want to be accused of cultural appropriation and appropriating stories of the indigenous people from, the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh people that lived in Stanley Park, the village of Sgsmåþkvær and other villages around the park, that I didn't want to be accused of cultural appropriation of those stories, not just in the tour itself, but in the marketing around it too. That was one thread blowing in the wind. I also, the land acknowledgements, what history we share and how we share it, both in the tours themselves and in the marketing. And then just starting to look into, what is good practice as a citizen of Vancouver and as a company owner around reconciliation. And it became obvious, right away when I was looking into this, that, it's imperative to make a financial contribution and to step up and say, no, we're going to help financially to the extent that we can. We're a small family-owned company. We're not TELUS or, some massive multinational, but to the extent we can to make a financial contribution to non-profits and charities that are doing the hard work of supporting indigenous people in our communities who've been so harmed by colonisation and particularly the residential school system. And so these all tie together into what became Project Sunrise to try and do a better job around this. And so we now have a donation program that a percentage of revenue from all our public walking tours goes to support a number of different charities. And I was actually at the Urban Native Youth Association, just a short walk from here earlier today, who's our partner charity for the Lost Souls of Gastown tour.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so I think that was something that I think was an important step for us to do, and I'm pleased that we do that. Our land acknowledgements definitely are much better connected to the work that we do now, to the tours themselves. It's not, I don't know about you, when you go to, a live performance or a theatre and you hear this land acknowledgement and then it's like, okay, on with the experience that is completely disconnected from the land acknowledgement. It feels very like, like very little thought has gone into that. And so I want to make sure that every guide on every tour, gives a meaningful land acknowledgement that connects to them personally, the land that they're on, the history that they're telling, and the audience that they're with.
Right.
And people are invited to really reflect during the land acknowledgement about like what they're doing and where they are.
Right. So it's more about focusing on the action of reconciliation as opposed to just paying lip service.
Yeah, I think probably paying lip service is exactly what I didn't want us to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I feel good that I think we've made some big improvements there, the donation program. But I still felt that we were struggling with how do we tell the world that we're sharing stories and histories of our Indigenous communities without doing it in a way that's going to upset those communities or upset people that are concerned that Indigenous people are given their own voices and they get to share stories themselves. So it was evident I wasn't going to solve that myself, that question. I needed to consult. We spent quite a while looking for who can help support us. And we had some really good help from Destination Vancouver and from the Indigenous Tourism of BC organisation. It does a fantastic job supporting Indigenous-owned tourism businesses, and they had some good resources for us to help us. And eventually we were referred to Hereditary Chief Ian Campbell of the Squamish Nation, with thanks to the Squamish Lillooet Cultural Centre, who actually put us in contact with Chief Ian Campbell. And he held a workshop for us. We invited some other tourism companies that we're partners with as well to come and hear from Ian, who has a long history working in tourism, as well as being a leader in the Squamish Nation. He's worked a lot with real estate development as well, and helping the Squamish Nation and more broadly all the local nations in some of their plans to house their own communities and provide housing as well for the broader community of people in Vancouver. And he spoke, and it was absolutely one of the highlights of my work in leading Forbidden Vancouver, to hear him speak about his people, the history going back millennia on this land, some of the legends, the perspective he had on how the Squamish Nation went through and continues to go through colonialism, and also the incredible plans and vision that the Squamish Nation has and the other local nations for the future for their communities was very, very impressive. And to be able to share some of those perspectives on tours and to say, well, Chief Ian Campbell gave me permission to share this story with you, that really helped close a gap that I think was becoming for me the most difficult thing about running the company, actually. So I felt the responsibility to act, but I felt a bit paralyzed around it. And he really helped show me a way, like lit a path for me to like, this is a path you can go on. And we still share emails, we're still in contact. He's a really, really nice guy. And I'm very, very thankful for the support he's given me.
Right. And I mean, that kind of answers part of my next question, which is around when you're in the process of trying to tell Indigenous stories, are you consulting Indigenous people? And obviously you are. And are you including Indigenous people in Forbidden Vancouver Walking Tours by, I don't know, hiring them or bringing them on to tell various stories?
Absolutely, yeah. So we, last count, I think we have 3 of our storytellers who identify as Indigenous. I think they're all Métis. Mm-hmm. We had a 4th who just moved to Manitoba.
Oh,
but still works for the company in a kind of operations role. So yeah, we have Indigenous storytellers in the team. We don't have anyone who's from the Squamish, Musqueam or Tsleil-Waututh nations. We're very open to recruiting, of course, from those communities, and we always put that in our job postings. Again, I think it speaks to, and I don't think we're unique in this way, that having a diverse workforce is very, very important. I feel a responsibility for us to have diversity in our workforce, and it also makes us a much better and stronger company.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that leads well into the next question, which is, what is your hope for the future of Forbidden Vancouver Walking Tours?
Yeah, it's a funny question because I've just been catching up with a lot of my guides. It's a funny thing, this work, because often as a guide, you're working on your own a lot. Like you might be doing the Stanley Park tour. Well, I might not see you for like weeks, even months. You do your regular slot, Stanley Park at 4:00, and I might see you you have an office in Gastown, but you might not go to the office before your tour. Some guides do and get changed, some don't. So sometimes I go quite a long time without seeing people in the team, and I worry that it can be a bit lonely work. Well, even though you're there with a group of people every tour, in terms of seeing other people within the company, it can be a while sometimes. Some of the guides I see Like Glenn, for example, does a ton of tours. I see him all the time, but some of our guys might do like one tour every couple of weeks, so I don't see them that much. We try and have team socials and that kind of things that all get together. But I've been trying to get around and see everybody recently, and I always find that when I speak to guys in the team, they always have the question of, well, like, how are we doing? Like, what we got planned? Like, how's it been going? Because if you're just doing your one tour, you might not see the bigger picture of how the company's doing. We've had a great year, had a great couple of years. I'm very thankful for all the support we have in the city. There's so many people out there who've taken like every one of our walking tours and experiences and speak really glowingly to their friends and online about our work. And I'm so thankful for the people that do that. We haven't got a big marketing budget, and that word of mouth is absolutely vital. And just that I feel really proud to have created something that people like genuinely feel connected to and feel they really enjoy, and they seek out to spend their money on and their time doing that. That means a lot to me. And we've had a really, really great couple of years. I think I'm really looking forward to next year. We've just got a brand new tour we've launched actually for the holiday period called the Holiday History and Hot Chocolate Tour, which is a version of our Monumental Scandals tour that explores the most fabulous heritage buildings we have downtown, like the Hotel Vancouver, the Marine. We have a private viewing inside the Marine building. Finished off with a hot chocolate at Mink Chocolate, which is an award-winning chocolatier on Hornby Street. The sales been going really well for that already. I'm really excited for how that's shaping up. I've always wanted to have a regular holiday period experience. So this experience, we're inside so much of the time. We can really run it in all kinds of weather because every stop's like undercover or inside, which is not the case of all our tours. Like the Stanley Park tour in a rainstorm in November can be challenging. I bet, yeah. Right, but this tour's, you're inside so much that you can do it in all manner of weather, which is great. So I'm looking forward to next year. I think we've got an amazing team of guides. We've got a really strong portfolio of really well-tested tours that, we've really fine-tuned the content on them. And some special events this year as well that we also are going to keep going next year, which have been really, really popular. I was at last night at one of our most popular special events, Secrets of the Penthouse at the Penthouse nightclub on Seymour Street. Okay. Which has been there for 70 years. Mm-hmm. And we do a night of history, jazz music and Italian food, where the club owner, Danny Filipponi, who is just turned 60, he started working in the club when he was like 15. So he's worked his whole life there. His father and uncles opened the club back in 1947. Officially, it was actually running all the way back in the late 30s, almost like a speakeasy. And he does a guided tour inside the private spaces of the club that have been closed to the public for a long time. Talks about the many different people that have frequented that club over the years, from like Sammy Davis Jr. to Frank Sinatra to Sting to like Ray Liotta from Goodfellas. It's been a place that so many different people have been to over the years. And we also have the historian Aaron Chapman come, and I've partnered with Aaron on many different experiences over the years. He's a fantastic historian and also orator. And so Aaron wrote the book Liquor, Lust and the Law, the history of the legendary Penthouse nightclub. He comes and speaks about its history. Dan is there, who talks about his family's connection to nightclub history, which is really a fascinating story. I mean, it's a story really of an Italian family that came here all the way back, I think in the 1920s, and then these four brothers who went on to build this sort of nightclub dynasty here in the city, which is still being run today, is really something. It's truly unique. Like, how many venues in our city have been owned and run by the same family for 70 years? Yeah, that's incredible. None, mm-hmm. And we also get retired VPD cops along who used to raid the club in the 60s and 70s. In the 60s, when they didn't have a liquor license, so they do dry squad raids. Mm-hmm. And we have a retired police officer, Grant McDonald, who's a huge guy. He's in his 80s now, but he's like 6'5". And it must have been really something when he walked in doing a dry squad raid in the 60s, and you all had to hide your liquor under the table. Right. When that happened. And then in the 70s, he would do undercover work there, spying on mobsters who were like working out of the upstairs of the club. There was no gang squad in those days. Today, mobsters are, if you turn up and you're a gangster in a nightclub downtown, the gang squad come and escort you out right away. But that wasn't the case in the 70s. So there were, many underworld figures who kind of worked out of the club. Danny's uncle Joe, who was the patriarch of the whole family, was sadly murdered there in 1983. There was a vice squad raid there in the late 70s. The club closed for 3 years. As a result of that, the case went to the Supreme Court of Canada, where the family actually won on appeal. And there was a devastating fire there in 2011 that almost burnt the whole place to the ground. So it's survived a lot, and it's still going.
Yeah.
We have a fantastic jazz band called the Russell Schulberg Trio who rock on stage during the dinner, and we have an Italian dinner, spaghetti and meatballs cooked according to Mama Filippone's recipe from the old country. So we've done that over 100 times now that night, and we've sold out 5 years in a row, every single month. So we had a full house last night of about 50 people, and I think it really resonates with locals who come. It's almost like people come to pay homage to the city's history and their own personal or family history, where this was a place that Aaron likes to joke at the end of the tour. It's the only place in Vancouver you can go where you can be at family dinner on a Sunday and say, guess where I was on last night? I was at the Penthouse. And your dad can say, you know, when I was your age, I went to the Penthouse. And your grandfather will lean over and say, Penthouse? I met your grandmother in the Penthouse. Nowhere else can you do that in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. So it's got a real special place in a lot of people's hearts. We also had a tour this year called The Last Gang in Town, another book that Aaron wrote about gang history, like street gang history back in the 60s and 70s. We don't really have this kind of street gang culture today. Everyone thinks of gangsters today as like driving Range Rovers and shooting each other in parking lots and stuff. But
something out of The Wire.
Yeah, like this was more like youth, like teen street hoods, you know, fighting with each other. And the most notorious gang was the Clark Park gang. Clark Park's not a million miles from here up Commercial Drive.
Close, yeah.
Yeah. And so they were kind of feared street gang, and they were blamed for, there was a riot at a Rolling Stones concert in 1972. They got blamed for starting this riot, the Exile on Main Street tour. They got blamed for starting the riot that happened outside the stadium that day. It was really due to counterfeit tickets being sold and whatnot, but they got a lot of notoriety because of that. And then, you know, they were kind of a crime spree of around the neighborhood of, you know, break and entry, stolen cars, that kind of stuff. And it was probably very unpleasant to me to come across the Clark Park gang in Clark Park at night. I don't think that would not be a nice interaction. And they were definitely some tough young men and women in that gang. But the the Vancouver Police Department really came down hard on them. They actually set up their own gang. They got like 30 of their toughest constables and dressed them in leather jackets and sent them to Clark Park kind of like undercover to like beat up these kids and say like, we're the new gang in town, you guys need to beat it. And there's stories of this, and they knew they were cops, like the kids, and they like these young kids who were like, you know, 18, being grabbed by these three like 30-year-old men, having their like shoes pulled off them and their coat, chucked in the back of a car, driven to the Fraser River, thrown in the river, and have the cops like shooting live rounds, saying like, you better knock it off. We know who you are. We know what you're doing. And these kids having to climb out of the Fraser River and then, you know, walk home soaking wet in the middle of the night. So there's actually a protest march against the police aggression in the neighborhood.
I can
back
imagine
in the early 70s.
Like
and it ended sadly with the police actually killing one of the Clark Park, shooting and killing one of the Clark Park gang members one night. Which sort of brought the whole story to a close, really. And a lot of those, the gang kind of, as time went on, it kind of fizzled out. And, you know, these young people grew up, and a lot of them went on to like quite serious criminal careers and spent a lot of time in prison. Aaron wrote this book about this I think fascinating and little known story of Vancouver's past, The Last Gang in Town. And he interviewed some of these police officers and gang members, and then we get two of these gang members, Danny Mouse Williamson and Bradley Bennett, who are now reformed characters, and they're probably they're in their late 60s now, and they after quite a long time eventually went straight and left their life of crime behind them. And they come and talk about their lives and what it was like being in that gang, being, you know, what was it like being in prison as a Clark Park gang member? And apparently you were untouchable in prison if you were in the Clark Park gang and everyone left you alone. And they're people from a walk of life that a lot of people don't get to meet on an everyday basis. And it's really fascinating to provide that opportunity, I think, for people to come and share their story. They don't try and dress it up. They tell their take on what it was like to be part of that gang and have that conflict with the police at that time. So that's been a really popular tour as well that we've done. We've got one coming up. It's fully sold out already, December 3rd, backstage at the Commodore, again with Aaron. He wrote the book Live at the Commodore about the history of the Commodore Ballroom. So we're doing a talk there and a guided tour inside the building and going backstage, which should be a lot of fun. We've done that a few times. So yeah, we've got a lot going on. Our most popular tour continues to be the Lost Souls of Gastown, which is
the one that I was on.
You were on, yeah. I mean, that's really captured a lot of imaginations, I think. And I think it's that we have the degree of theatre involved in that, and that it's not really a walking tour. It's more like a roving one-person play through those, back streets and alleyways of Victorian Gastown. We're really lucky that Gastown was saved in the 70s. It was really demolished, and it was saved, and the kind of priceless jewel that it is today, that it's been so well preserved, and to walk through there. And my intention with that experience is that as an audience member, you quickly forget that it's 2023. You're not there with an actor who's like acting in quotation marks, but you feel like, oh, wow, it's like you're really there with someone at that time, talking to you about what it was like to live there and telling you their story. And when I first created that experience, this was back in 2012, my intention had been to create a Halloween experience and tell kind of ghostly tales in Gastown, wear a top hat, carry a lantern, have a theatrical air to my storytelling. But I'd just been through acting school for like a year. And I wrote the whole tour in that way of talking about like the Great Fire, smallpox outbreaks, unsolved murder, try and really evoke what it was like in Gastown, back in the late 1860s to the, about 1900. Then I thought to myself, what if I really try and challenge myself as an actor and take this one step further, and rather than saying the fire swept down Water Street faster than a sprinting man, I was the man sprinting down Water Street and the fire was licking the skin off my back as I went. I thought it'd be a much more powerful and evocative way to present the story of our city's earliest years. And I've been really blown away by its continued success. Like it's like going on 12 years now, and it's still popular. It still sells out. We get tons of tourists in the summer come on it. We've got an amazing cast of guides and storytellers who lead that tour. Some really, really talented actors. We're very blessed in Vancouver with the quality of actors that we have here in the city. Some of the acting schools, the number of people who move here to act, it's really something. So I feel blessed that we're able to tap into that priceless resource that we have, and that we can really bring that city's earliest years to life.
I mean, what I'm learning through all of this is that there's plenty more tours that I really need to check out.
Yeah. You have to let me know when you want to come.
Absolutely. The holiday one sounds amazing. I feel like I should see if I can get some friends to
100%.
One of the questions that I like to ask on all of these podcasts is what our audience can do to help. And it's a little bit different in this case because a lot of the time I'm interviewing nonprofit organizations or local advocates. But what can our audience do to help preserve our history, do you think?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, obviously, I'm going to say, come on one of my tours.
Yeah.
Come on all of them. But, and you for sure, you'll learn about Vancouver history coming on our tours, no question about that. And so many people, well, I'm in this boat, right? I grew up in England. I didn't grow up here. So many people here didn't grow up in Vancouver and come here and never really take the time to learn about its history. And I think they do have a responsibility when you move somewhere to learn about where you are and its past. And so we're one very accessible way you can do that. If you don't want to buy history books and read them, you don't want to go to the archives, you don't want to go to, maybe more dry talks that are out there about Vancouver history, I promise that our experiences are not dry. You will have a fun time. We're there to entertain and share Vancouver history.
So that's attest to that.
Yeah, thank you. So we're an accessible way to do that. If you do want to go deeper, there are some amazing history books out there that are also a really, really fun read. And I think we're really blessed in the city right now with the crop of history writers that we have. Aaron Chapman, I've talked about, he's got 5 very fun and accessible and fundamentally interesting history books that he's published. Eve Lazarus is another history writer who's written some fantastic books on Vancouver history. She writes a lot, and she also podcasts about cold cases in Canada. I don't know if you know about the Babes in the Woods story in Stanley Park. It was a unsolved murder of 2 children from 1947. And it was thanks to Eve's tireless reporting on, she started her career as a journalist, which has obviously been very useful for her in transitioning to history writing, her blogging and her podcasting work as well. She has a tremendous output that she has. And she really took on the mantle of the Babes in the Woods story and trying to solve this case. And last year, after I guess that's over 70 years, the case was finally solved.
Wow.
and they found out who the identity of these two children were thanks to the latest DNA technology, and thanks to Eve for kind of keeping that flame alive and keeping that interest out there in the world about who were these two children. That it was solved. Their names were Derek and David Dalton. They were two young boys, and no one knows who killed them. Sadly, they were left in Stanley Park. I think they were aged like 10 and 8, around there, those ages. It's a tragic tale, but Eve's work around it is absolutely fascinating. I mean, her podcast is amazing, listening to the story of the babes in the woods and how it went through these different iterations of crime fighting technology, trying to find out who did it, until eventually, after 70 years, they had the technology to get the full DNA of those two children and then match online and find out who they were. She has a book called Blood, Sweat and Fear about a guy called Inspector Vance, who was like a sort of coroner of the city for years back in the mid-20th century. There's actually an exhibition coming up at the Police Museum about Inspector Vance. And his story of like all these, it's like a kind of different CSI, the TV show, kind of like a 1940s version of that. With like 1940s technology is kind of what he did. And all the cases he solved, people tried to kill him, people tried to blow up his car. And he's like, oh, whatever, I'll just walk to work today. And like kept going, like totally unfazed. Wow. And all the cases he solved with using like very rudimentary crime, like forensic technology. It's a really, really fascinating read. So Dan Francis, who's been writing history books for many years in the city, if you've heard of the book Red Light Neon about history of sex work in Vancouver.
Oh, I do seem to recall that.
Yeah, so I think it's the seminal work on that history. And it traces it all the way back to like Birdie Stewart with her bawdy house in Gastown in like the 1870s, all the way up to the modern day. It's a really interesting read. And how various sort of the changes in social norms and policing have really persecuted particularly vulnerable people who work in the sex trade, and what the impacts of that have been,
right,
and how that's really morphed over the years. But it's always been a feature of Vancouver since like day one. And Birdie Stewart was one of the first residents of Vancouver, even before it was the city of Vancouver. So that's a really interesting. He's got some great books on Vancouver history as well. So yeah, there's a lot of really, really incredible history writers out there that I recommend looking up. Lanny Russworm, who's got the blog Past Tense Vancouver, does a lot of research for us as well. Amazing researcher, and has unearthed so many interesting stories, particularly of 20th century, that kind of interwar period of Vancouver, the Great Depression. His blog, Past Tense Vancouver, well worth a read. You can easily lose hours of your life in there, reading all the different stories that he's put together.
Right. Well, I'll do a little shameless plug here as well. We did an episode not too long ago about war with Michael Kluckner.
Oh, Michael Kluckner, yeah.
And he talked about what it was like to live through all the various wars right here in Vancouver.
Right,
it's a really interesting perspective as well.
Yeah, he's a great historian. He's a great artist as well.
He is. Yeah. We're kind of getting close to the end of this podcast here, but I want to pass it over to you to talk about anything that we haven't already discussed that you feel like you'd like to bring up.
I feel like you've really given me the opportunity to talk freely on my, my thoughts about the company and what we've achieved and where we're going. You can find us at forbiddenvancouver.ca, and you'll see the full summary of all our different tours and pricing and when they happen, etc. Or you can follow us at Forbidden Vancouver on Instagram or TikTok, or at Forbidden Vancouver Walking Tours on Facebook.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Nicola. Thanks for having me.
And this has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING. Today I've been joined by Will Woods from Forbidden Vancouver Walking Tours, and we'll catch you in the next one.
You've been listening to a social justice podcast hosted by NICOLA SPURLING, brought to you by the Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book.